Mr. Valukas, your report tells us about the engineering and legal findings with GM, but what it doesn't divulge is whether GM attorneys made conscious decisions during discovery, and other product liability lawsuits that prevented the truth from coming out sooner and potentially saving lives. That kind of malfeasance should be the crux of a cover-up. I wanted to delve deeper into that issue today and find out if that occurred.
But the report, unfortunately, does not answer all of the key questions. It does not fully explain how the ignition switch was approved without meeting specifications, and then how it was redesigned in 2006. It does not fully explain why stalling was not considered a safety issue within GM. And most troubling, as the chairman alluded to, the report does not fully explain how this dysfunctional company culture took root and persisted. The report singles out many individuals at GM who made poor decisions or failed to act, but it doesn't identify one individual in a position of high leadership who was responsible for these systemic failures. The report absolves previous CEOs, the legal department, Ms. Barra, and the GM board from knowing about the tragedy beforehand. This is nothing to be proud of.
On June 2nd, Mr. Valukas presented the findings of his investigation to the Board of Directors of General Motors.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Even closer, if you would, sir.
Even closer?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Up. Now I got it? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In March of this year, General Motors asked me to determine why it took so long to recall the Cobalt and other vehicles that contained this faulty and defective switch, which has resulted in such disaster for General Motors and for the families who were involved in this matter. My explicit mandate from the General Motors Board of Directors was to promote and provide an unvarnished report as to how and why this occurred, to pursue the facts wherever they took us, and to report those facts in a report. General Motors Board also directed me to make recommendations based on those factual findings to help them ensure that this did not happen again. Jenner & Block, my firm, was given unfettered access to General Motors witnesses and documents. In point of fact, we interviewed in the 70 days or so 230 witnesses, some of them multiple times, so we had about approximately 350 interviews, some of them lasting 6 to 8 hours. We reviewed over 41 million documents coming from the files of everybody from the top executives down to the individuals who were involved at the most technical level. That number of documents involved tens of millions of materials that were personally reviewed by individual reviewers. And all of this was in an effort to find out the facts as to why this Cobalt recall took over a decade and why that defective switch remained unaccounted for during that period of time. I provided a copy of the report. The copy of that report was provided to the committee. I'm not going to go through the details, but the story of the Cobalt is a story of individual and organizational failures that have led to devastating consequences. Throughout the decade, it took General Motors to recall the Cobalt. There was, as has already been described here this morning by one of the members, a lack of accountability, a lack of urgency, and extraordinarily a failure of the company personnel charged with safety issues to understand how this car was manufactured and the interplay between the switch and other aspects of the automobile. In our report, we review these failures and identify cultural issues that may have contributed to this problem. As General Motors Board requested, we have provided recommendations to help ensure that this problem does not take place in the future. But as we note in my written statement to you, that is an issue with which GM must deal. The report does not give all of the answers. Thank you.
Does an employee who acts alone or who hides or doesn't share information a cover-up?
If the individual knows that the information is for instance, a safety information and understands that and deliberately decides to conceal that, that's a cover-up. Yes, it is.
And a corporate culture of carelessness where life-saving information sits in file boxes collecting dust, as you referred to, is that a cover-up?
What we found in connection with this, Mr. Chairman, was the following. We found that a large number of individuals had information that they did, in the first instance, they didn't believe was safety-related information. Clearly up to about 2009, they looked at this as a convenience matter. and they dealt with it that way. We did not find evidence that any individual had a piece of evidence in connection with this cobalt recall which they considered to be safety information which they deliberately withheld from somebody else.
Ms. Barr, I want to start with some of the comments you made in your opening remarks. I have a couple of questions I want to talk to you about. You mentioned specifically that you had promised that you would conduct a comprehensive and transparent investigation. Do you believe that that was accomplished?
I think the Valukas report was comprehensive. It was very far-reaching, and we have shared that information.
And you also said that you promised you would share the findings of the report with Congress, our regulators, NHTSA, and the courts. This is a copy of the report that we received, and it states on the very front page of the report, privileged and confidential, protected by attorney-client privilege and as attorney work product. You indicated that you hired Mr. Valukas to do this independent investigation, but it's obvious from the report that you considered this to be an attorney-client relationship, and the report itself has sections blacked out so that we on this panel don't know who some of the victims were that are identified in the report. Were you aware of that?
Yes.
Mr. Valukas, you focused on this culture at GM in your report. You weren't here the first time when I showed Ms. Barra this screwdriver that was handed out by General Motors in the 70s and 80s as a promotional item, and it says safety comes first at GM on this screwdriver. As part of your investigation of the history and culture of GM, did you look back at whether the old GM had made safety a priority the same way that Ms. Barra says the new GM is committed to it here today? And aren't there institutional problems that are much more far-reaching than simply firing 15 employees?
Congressman, that's a good question. We looked back and solicited from everybody that we interviewed information about whether something in the culture caused them to do something differently than they otherwise would have done, or whether safety became a secondary issue. Almost uniformly, people would say to us, safety was the top priority. But we identified in this report all of the instances of which we were aware relating to this matter where people took a different position, so it's there. And I would not ascribe to everybody the conduct of the people involved here, but I do say that culture had something to do with the reason why this recall took so long. You had circumstances where, among other things, you have a sensitivity to the use of the word stalls, which might have created for someone the impression that maybe we stay away from using words which will force people to ask hard questions rather than taking an approach in which you ask the hard questions and take whatever those answers are.
Mr. Valukas, and I think you alluded to this a few minutes ago, if not for the Brooke Melton lawsuit, and Brooks, I can't see the back of the room, but her picture may be up there on the wall. She's in my district in Paulding County, Georgia, the 11th Congressional District of Georgia. If not for the Brooke Melton lawsuit, and she was killed, and the fact that her lawyers figured out that the ignition switch part from model year 2008 was different from model years 2005, 6, and 7 in the Cobalt, would we even know about this ignition switch problem today? Would we even be aware of it?
The answer is yes, because there was an open and, at that point, significant investigation going on at that particular point. And certainly there was information and evidence that was accumulating as they were going forward, pointing to the fact that they had these non-deployments, pointing to the fact they had fatalities, and pointing to the fact that the switch had something to do with it.
Well, that smacks of a big cover-up to me. And after General Motors learned of this change, it took months for GM outside experts to confirm that there had been a change. Why did this take so long?
I don't have a good answer for that. I can tell you it did take that long. I can tell you that from the time of April of 2013, when that deposition took place, they knew or should have known at that, or they knew at that point that they had two different switches, and they gave it to Mr. Malati, the expert, and he came back with his confirmation of what they were given in the way of information in April, and that took until almost October.
I should ask a clarifying question, because the doctor referred to it, and a number of members have asked with regard to the word cover-up. Could you define what cover-up means, Mr. Valukas?
In this instance, what we looked for was any evidence that individuals knew that they had a safety issue and took steps to conceal the fact that they had a safety issue. That's what we were looking for in terms of cover-up. And when we interviewed individuals, we asked them questions to gather the facts to see whether, in fact, that had taken place, and we sought to test those facts against the documents that we were reviewing. So if someone knew something on a given day, we identified that, and then we took steps to see whether they concealed what they knew from other individuals. We did not find that. That's what I'm talking about.
Does your definition then also include if people slow-walked moving on safety issues? Does that also cover up?
If it was a, pardon me, I don't mean to interrupt.
That's okay.
If it was deliberately done, then it would encompass something like that. If it was a matter of someone being in a position, for instance, when one of the investigators was given the assignment, he was given no deadline, he was given no sense of urgency, so he put it into the queue with other investigation, and it took its time. That I would not call a cover-up. I would call that something other than that.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Valukas report identifies Mr. Ray DiGiorgio, who you said, Ms. Barry, has no credibility. The GM design release engineer, was his title, as being almost solely responsible for key decisions to approve the deadly ignition switch in 2002 and to modify it in 2006. Mr. Valukas, your report states that one of the key failures was, quote, the decision by a single engineer who did not advise others of his decision to accept an ignition switch with full knowledge that it fell well below GM's own specifications. Is that correct?
Correct.
The implication here is that Mr. DiGiorgio acted alone. But the report describes problems associated with the ignition switch, aside from low torque, many of which were known as early as 2001. According to the report, the, quote, entire electrical concept needed to be redesigned, end quote. The switch had significant problems that were known to GM. Knowledge of the problem is important. Torque problems plagued the switch from the start, and the Valukas report says that in 2006, Mr. DiGiorgio, again, unilaterally approved changes to the switch to increase the torque. Mr. Valukas' report notes, quote, there is no evidence that DiGiorgio told others at GM, including engineers on the Cobalt program, about the spring change to the ignition switch that he authorized in April of 2006. So, Mr. Valukas, the report does note that other GM employees had received documents describing the ignition switch change as early as June 2006, and that these documents clearly indicated that the switches used in pre-2007 models were not within specifications. Is that correct?
The answer to that question is there were emails which were forwarded to other individuals which contained within those emails, after the change was made, information about the fact that the torque had changed. We interviewed those individuals. Those individuals were, by and large, in the warranty area. They were looking at something that it meant nothing to them, as the two that we were able to locate and find. They were totally unaware of the issues concerning the switch not deploying any aspect of it. So the one individual who did know all of the facts and had that information was Mr. DiGiorgio. The other engineers who were on this email chain, it meant nothing to them.
Knowledge of the problem is important. Torque problems plagued the switch from the start, and the Valukas report says that in 2006, Mr. DiGiorgio, again, unilaterally approved changes to the switch to increase the torque. Mr. Valukas' report notes, quote, there is no evidence that DiGiorgio told others at GM, including engineers on the Cobalt program, about the spring change to the ignition switch that he authorized in April of 2006. So, Mr. Valukas, the report does note that other GM employees had received documents describing the ignition switch change as early as June 2006, and that these documents clearly indicated that the switches used in pre-2007 models were not within specifications. Is that correct?
The answer to that question is there were emails which were forwarded to other individuals which contained within those emails, after the change was made, information about the fact that the torque had changed. We interviewed those individuals. Those individuals were, by and large, in the warranty area. They were looking at something that it meant nothing to them, as the two that we were able to locate and find. They were totally unaware of the issues concerning the switch not deploying any aspect of it. So the one individual who did know all of the facts and had that information was Mr. DeGiorgio. The other engineers who were on this email chain, it meant nothing to them.
Okay. So, but there is an email, I'm holding it here, cited in your report, discusses implementation of the new...
Reference at page 102 and footnote.
I believe that's right. And the quote is, increase torque forces to be within specifications. And it was sent to 5 GM employees on June 2nd, 2006. But we have also obtained another document that was not included in your report. And this document indicates that another GM contract engineer may have approved the 2006 change. It's a production part approval process report obtained by Delphi through GM's global quality tracking system. It is dated June 1st, 2006, and it lists GM supplier quality engineer, a GM supplier quality engineer. The document has a section labeled, quote, supplier quality engineer notes, and these notes read, this is a quote, new PCB and spring plunger implementation for performance improvement. Part approved per supplier, submitted warrant, and GM 3660. So, Mr. Valukas, have you seen that report, the Global Quality Tracking System?
Yes.
So did you interview the listed supply quality engineer or look into what role he might have played in approving the switch change in 2006?
We did the following. We looked at that form change, and what happened with that form change was the following. So the supply quality engineer's function is to determine whether the boxes are filled out and materials are properly identified here, and then he submits that and puts that into the system. He does not have, as we understand it, anything to do with making decisions on the change. He's actually functioning as somebody putting something into the system. Did we do an interview? I don't think we interviewed that particular individual. We know what his function was and what the role was.
Well, I don't want to minimize Mr. DeGiorgio's role or excuse his actions in any way, but I do think these documents point to the fact that the problem at GM is deeper than just one rogue engineer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Valukas, your report discusses an early May 2005 email related to a customer concern about the ignition switch. That's at tab 12 of the folder that you have there. Your report focused on Mr. DeGiorgio's awareness of this exchange. There were others on this change, including Doug Parks. What was Doug Parks' position at the time?
I honestly don't recall his title at that time.
Wasn't he the vehicle chief engineer?
He may well have been. As I say, I don't recall.
Why was it more significant that let's assume that he was, because that's what we think he was. Why was it more significant that Mr. DeGiorgio was aware of this exchange rather than the vehicle chief engineer?
I don't know that it was more significant. It was significant because Mr. DeGiorgio ultimately made the decision to change the part. And in our interviews with him, he said that he was not aware of the fact that this was an issue, that he was not aware of the publicity, he was not aware of the email traffic concerning this, while we had information that that was not, in fact, the case.
In a May 4th response to this chain, Mr. Parks requests a plug to insert in the key head, since it appears to be the only, in his quote, only real quick solution. But this solution was not implemented for months. Mr. Valukas, do you know why?
Part of the function of what was happening in the organization, they were treating this as a customer convenience issue rather than a safety issue. So they looked at issues in terms of price, expense, cost.
Rather than safety.
That was
okay.
it.
A few weeks later, on May 17th, a new PRTS was initiated. At the time, the program team decided to pursue additional solutions beyond the service fix for the key insert, a short-term production fix for a new key that changed the slot to a hole, and a long-term solution to introduce a more robust ignition switch. Who was responsible for initiating and implementing these changes?
These would have been the committees which were involved in the, and I don't have the committee name in front of me, I'll look at the report, but the committees that were involved in the review, and ultimately they didn't do what they said they were going to do.
Were they reviewed by the vehicle chief engineer?
I don't know that.
You don't know. Do you know?
As I read the Valukas report, I think what you're referring to was a continuous improvement team.
Okay.
And I believe the chief was not there. It was the program engineering manager.
Why did it take until 2009 to implement the new keyhead? And who was responsible for ensuring that this change was implemented? Do either of you know?
I can tell you that the reason it was delayed was because it was treated again as a customer convenience issue. They had an issue with regard to their supplier and a dispute with regard to his ability to deliver. And it wasn't until 2009 that the dispute was resolved, and they ultimately made that change with regard to the key.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for being here. Mr. Valukas, do you feel like that you conducted a thorough investigation?
Yes.
According to what you testified to today, if my math is right, how many people were on that team? How many people investigated along with you?
The number of individuals who were employed at one point or another in reviewing documents, doing interviews, several hundred.
Several hundred. According to my math, you all looked at 1,220 documents a minute.
I'm sorry, say that again, Councilman.
I said, according to my math, you all looked at 1,220 documents a minute. If you said you had access to 41 million documents over a 70-day period, I don't know how in the world you could do a thorough investigation in that time frame.
Congressman, we use computers and programs to analyze the documents for purposes of kicking out those documents which are reflective of the issues that are here. We use as part of that database requests are being made by Congress, requests are being made of us by the United States Attorney's Office, by NHTSA, and we isolated those documents and then gave them through 3 levels of review for purposes of determining whether they were relevant to any aspect here. I feel very comfortable. I can't tell.
So back to my first question. You do think it was a thorough investigation? I'm not in your business, and you are, so I'm just trying to learn here.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, the report that you released, were you given a deadline by General Motors on when that needed to be out?
I think with General Motors, the board of directors, when they employed me to do this investigation, asked me whether I could get it done within a certain time frame, and I told them we could. That was the deadline. It was my commitment that we could do it in that time period. Part of that was associated with the fact that they wanted to know, because there were deaths involved here, what caused it, what were the problems. Part of it was because of that we wanted to get the report out or to be able to respond to Congress, so we had that deadline.
And once you got your report completed, or once you completed the report, to whom at General Motors did you present the results?
Board of directors.
Okay. And what was their reaction?
The reaction, I can't tell you what the reaction was. I know the reaction was that is what you've seen with Ms. Barra here, to follow up on it.
Okay, so you didn't receive any resistance to your findings or your recommendations from the board?
None.
And were you asked to make any changes to your report?
No, I was not, and what I did tell them, and what I've mentioned to staff here, that if we found something different as we pursued, we'd continue to gather documents because there are requests here and elsewhere, we would review the report, and if there was anything in the report that we found to be an error or needed to be corrected or changed anything, we would report that back to the board, and I presume they would report it back to you.
So other than that, your report, does that end your investigation? And I've been here for about 90% of the hearing, but I did have to step out for a few minutes ago. So.
No, we believe we have completed the inquiry, but as I say, we would update it if we found something which changed in any significant way. I believe back last week we found something in the report that we corrected, and we notified your staff of that immediately.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to recognize the parents and family members in the back. Those photographs up there really keep reminding us why we're here and investigating today. Mr. Valukas, I want to ask you, because I want to go back to, I'm still stuck on how this sub-spec parts were even allowed at the very beginning of the process. So in that regard, the production part approval process that they go through and they do the testing, would that 2002 PPAP package be a key document in this investigation?
It certainly would be something I'd want to see. I think we sought it out. I don't think we ever found it. And we've asked Delphi for it, and we don't have it.
And Delphi wouldn't produce it?
They informed us they don't have it.
They don't have. Do you believe that?
I can only report what they told us. We made requests from them from the very beginning for access to any and all documents relating to this matter. What they produced to us were a limited number of documents, which were documents that had actually been exchanged with us. At least initially, I think we may have received a few additional documents over the time, but that's what we got.
So no one's been able to locate the PPAP on the ignition parts?
That's my understanding.
Ms. Barra, do you know whether or not the PPAP for this ignition parts from 2002 exist?
I don't. I believe Mr. Valukas and his team would have found it if it does exist. But what I can tell you is the part should have never been put in production.
Agree. And I'm proud you said that, but it would have been great to discover that in 2002 during the PPAP process. And the fact that it wasn't is disturbing in itself, and that's why I think those documents are extremely important, as you do, Mr. Valukas. Should this committee consider a subpoena of those records, since they were not produced, even though...
You put me where I cannot go. The committee is going to conduct its investigation. Let me say this, and I think this is important. It is clear, at least from our fact-finding, that Mr. DeGiorgio approved this part. Yes. And he approved this part knowing it was well below specifications, and we did not find anybody else who was involved in it, though Delphi certainly knew that the part that was being approved was below
and in that respect, you have this folder binder by you, and if you would turn to tab 4, and it is a memo from Raymond DeGiorgio regarding the talc issue. Now, this is an email from around April 2002. It's around the time the original switch was actually being approved. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the subject here is GMX 357 talc issue for the Saturn Ion, correct?
Correct.
And that talc, what role does the talc testing have on the approval of the switch? Do you know?
It's part of the process. It's how the feel, as it's been explained to me, how does it feel when you make the turn? You know, they wanted to make it feel like it was a European sports car or something like that.
Well, does this email from Raymond DeGiorgio to Raymond DeGiorgio, the answer from Mr. Reinecke, does that raise any concerns to you as the investigator, particularly the sentence that Mr. Reinecke did not find spring back from crank run to accessory as Terry Meehan and others had observed?
No.
Were you aware of these discussions around the time of the switch approval about the feel of that ignition switch?
Yes.
Your report says on page 2, quote, GM engineers concluded that moving stalls were not safety issues because drivers could still maneuver the cars. As a result, GM personnel viewed the switch problem as a customer convenience issue, something annoying but not particularly problematic as opposed to the safety defect it was. Is that right?
Correct.
And you told Mr. Johnson, so therefore, because they called it a customer convenience issue, they looked at issues of pricing and issues like that, not issues of safety. Is that right?
That is correct.
And this was despite the fact that really pretty early on, GM started getting a lot of complaints about the ignition shifting into neutral and the car losing all power. Is that right?
That is correct.
In fact, there was in a review of the Cobalt in the New York Times, in a review in the New York Times, the freelance writer said that his test Cobalt driven by his wife stalled after her knee bumped the steering column, right?
There were reports in the New York Times and other newspapers.
And Cleveland
calling
Plain
to the
Dealer
question.
and others. And so I find this kind of boggles my mind. A car could be going down the highway at a high rate of speed, 65 miles an hour, and it gets bumped, it goes into neutral, and then everything stops. The power steering, the brakes, the airbags. That's what happened to Brooke Melton, where she's driving down the highway in Hiram, Georgia on her 29th birthday. The ignition stops, the car loses power, she goes into the other lane, and she's killed. Do you know about that case?
I know about that case. I certainly do.
And so yet the GM engineer said that this was a convenience issue, right?
They not only said it internally, they said it publicly. When they were interviewed by the press, they said this is our position, that a stall does not constitute a safety issue, and that was one of the...
I mean, that's just insane, isn't it?
It is, won't use the word insane, but
Okay.
I'm troubled by that.
Yeah, okay, good. Now, at the same time, GM was talking to NHTSA about whether stalling was a safety risk. Are you aware of that?
I'm aware there were those conversations throughout this period of time.
Now, Ms. Barra, were you aware that at the same time NHTSA was talking to GM in June 2004 that General Motors recalled 15,000 Oldsmobile Bravadas and Envoys because of stalling risks?
I was not involved in that area.
So you're not aware of that? Now, well, Gay Kent signed that notice, and was Gay Kent reporting to you at that time?
No.
Okay. Did Gay Kent ever express any concern to you about the stalling and safety risks from the ions and cobalts?
No.
Okay. So basically, what you're saying in your report, Mr. Valukas, is you have these cars that stall out at any speed, really, and all of the power goes out, but yet the GM personnel maintain this was a customer convenience issue.
That is where they were, absolutely, from 2005 through 2009 at least.
Okay. Now, have you ever talked to a fellow named Clarence Ditlow, who's with the Center for Auto Safety?
I've received correspondence from him.
Did you receive this letter dated June 17, 2014 from him?
Packet?
I'm sorry?
Is it in the material that just given?
I don't know, but we can hand you a copy. Yes, we'll hand you a copy. And Mr. Ditlow's conclusion is that the Valukas report is clearly flawed in accepting GM's explanation that its engineers and senior managers did not know stalling was safety related. Are you aware of this claim that Mr. Ditlow made?
I am aware of this claim. Actually, I know I read this letter, and I sent him back a nice note saying thank you for the information.
And what's your view of that?
My view is that he didn't read the report and understand what my responsibility was here. You've asked my view, let me give my view. What we were charged to do, and I think this is very important to understand, we were charged by the Board of Directors to find the facts concerning how and why this occurred. We were charged with laying those facts before the board, and we were charged with making recommendations. And the board was charged with the responsibility, I presume, of making decisions whether or not the employees within the organization to the top level lived up to their responsibilities. That was where the board's responsibility was. So the suggestions in here that, you know, we didn't cover up people or we didn't that we exonerated certain people, it's just simply not correct.
Mr. Valukas, I really appreciate that answer because you clearly delineated what you were hired to do, and you believe you were hired to do that, correct?
That is correct.
Now, so there may be other information that this committee needs to gather beyond your report, right?
That is
And
absolutely possible, and as I said before, if we found new information as we went along, which reflected on it, we would share it.